In the long, neon-lit hallway of American pop culture, the 1990s had a particular way of announcing themselves. Sometimes it was with a slap bracelet snap, sometimes with a dial-up screech, and sometimes with a t-shirt that seemed to be yelling motivational threats at the universe. For a stretch of years that now feels both recently familiar and impossibly far away, No Fear was less a logo than a public service announcement delivered in block letters. It wasn't merely something a teenager wore. It was something a teenager declared, like a flag planted in the soft earth of adolescence. This is who I am, or at least who I would like everyone to think I am while I'm standing by my locker. The origin story begins, as many 1990s artifacts did, with California horsepower and a belief that life should be louder. No Fear was created in 1989 by Mark Simo, Brian Simo, and Marty Moats, and it carried the DNA of action sports before action sports had been neatly boxed into highlight reels and corporate sponsorship decks. The late 1980s and early 1990s were ripe for a brand built around speed, sweat, and that peculiar American optimism that insists danger is mainly a branding opportunity. Skateboarding was shaking off its earlier outlaw image and finding a broader audience. Motocross was growing into a lifestyle as much as a weekend hobby. Snowboarding was becoming the cool, younger cousin of skiing, with its own slang, its own swagger, and an allergy to anything that looked like a rule. Into this stepped a name so simple it sounded like a dare. No Fear had the blunt efficiency of a highway sign. It offered a promise that was impossible to keep and therefore perfect for teenagers, who are famously willing to pledge allegiance to an idea with no intention of reading the fine print. The brand's secret weapon wasn't just the words "No Fear" splashed across a chest or a cap. It was everything that came after. Because No Fear's true genius was in the sermon printed on the back. At a time when clothing companies were satisfied with small logos and tasteful restraint, No Fear behaved as if every shirt was a tiny paperback book. The slogans were the star: existential, provocative, sometimes inspirational in a slightly unhinged way, and often delivered with the confident intensity of someone explaining the meaning of life while revving a dirt bike. A No Fear shirt could insist it had never lost, only to follow that with a time-related technicality. It could transform a hockey game into a philosophical weather report. It could take a simple athletic concept like second place and treat it as a moral failing. The message varied, but the vibe stayed consistent. Winning wasn't just preferable, it was an identity. Doubt wasn't just inconvenient, it was an enemy. Fear wasn't an emotion, it was a personal insult. This was not subtle apparel. This was wearable inner monologues. The early 1990s were already courting the idea of the extreme. The decade didn't simply enjoy sports. It wanted sports that looked like a near miss. It wanted helmets, airborne bodies, splintered boards, in the sense that someone's parents were probably worried. Media helped, of course. Televised competitions, glossy magazines, and endless slow-motion montages made it easy for kids to imagine themselves as one good weekend away from greatness. No Fear rode that wave with a surfer's timing and a marketer's grin. If extreme sports were about flirting with gravity, No Fear was about flirting with the concept of consequences. It also offered something especially valuable to its target audience: instant character. The brand appealed most strongly to youth looking for an edgy, street-savvy identity, and the shirts became common in high schools because they did a job high schoolers desperately needed done. They spoke first. They talked big. They occupied space. They acted as a kind of social armor for people still figuring out whether they wanted to be a skater, a jock, a future motocross legend, or simply someone who didn't want to look like they were trying too hard, while in fact trying extremely hard. At its height, No Fear was everywhere in the way only certain trends ever truly are. There are fads that feel popular, and then there are fads that become background scenery. No Fear became scenery. It wasn't limited to one clique either. It migrated. It showed up on athletes and on kids who could barely do a push-up without negotiating for snacks afterward. It appeared on the backs of people who had never touched a skateboard, and on the front seats of cars that had never seen a dirt road. It was worn under flannel, over long sleeves, with baggy shorts, with braided belts, with sneakers that looked like they'd been engineered for an Olympic sport called mall walking. By the mid-1990s, at the trend's peak, a No Fear shirt wasn't just a purchase. It was an announcement that a person had opinions about life, and those opinions were loud. The common themes leaned into absolute intolerance for weakness, hesitation, and authority. Some sometimes with a wink, and sometimes with the sincerity of a teen who had just discovered the word nihilism in the back of a philosophy book and decided it would look good next to a flaming skull. The shirts could be funny, grim, or oddly poetic. In any case, they were rarely quiet. The brand's ubiquity created its own form of comedy. It was hard not to notice the mismatch between message and reality in the average school hallway. A shirt might proclaim a fearless devotion to the edge, while its wearer carefully avoided stepping on a crack in the tile. A slogan might suggest a life of danger, while its owner stood in line for lunch, nervously watching to see if the pizza slices were the big ones or the smaller, sadder triangles. This contrast wasn't a flaw so much as the point. No Fear sold aspiration in cotton form. It gave kids a chance to audition for a bolder version of themselves without risking much more than a questionable tan line. And it wasn't only shirts. The brand expanded beyond apparel into a broader ecosystem, sponsoring athletes and attaching itself to the worlds that inspired it. Like many successful 1990s brands, No Fear learned that once a logo becomes a signal, it can travel. Hats, jackets, racing gear, decals, and posters all helped spread the message. A certain kind of American vehicle became a moving billboard. The rear window transformed into a declaration of toughness, whether or not the vehicle had ever exceeded the speed limit for reasons other than being late to practice. Later, as the culture of energy drinks rose and the idea of fueling a lifestyle became a business model, No Fear put its name on a can through a partnership with So Be. The drink came in multiple versions and flavors, including an original grapefruit sugar-free, a berry version called Motherload, and a bloodshot variety that mixed orange and dragon fruit. In the logic of the time, this made perfect sense. If a shirt could promise fearlessness, then a beverage could promise the chemical confidence to match. It was as if the brand looked at the American teenager and said, first we'll give you words, then we'll give you caffeine so you can believe them faster. The broader action sports marketing machine welcomed the synergy. No Fear's energy drink became tied to promotions and sponsorships, including involvement with World Extreme Cage Fighting as an official energy drink and sponsorship connections within motorsports and fighting. The brand's presence in these arenas reinforced the idea that No Fear wasn't merely a clothing line. It was a passport to a world where everything looked like it was happening at top speed, preferably with pyrotechnics. This was also the era when brands became templates. Success invited imitation, and imitation arrived promptly, sometimes with earnestness and sometimes with mischief. Knockoffs and parodies sprouted in the spaces between malls, big box stores, and youth group fundraisers. Where No Fear had existential bravado, parodies swapped in gentler morals, jokes, or faith-based reassurance. The cultural footprint was large enough that even people who didn't wear No Fear recognized the format. Bold front, punchy back, a tiny manifesto folded into a sleeve. If you can parody something and still be instantly understood, you've made it. Of course, what goes up in a blaze of bold typography eventually comes down, often quietly, while everyone is distracted by the next thing. No Fear's decline wasn't a single dramatic moment so much as a gradual change in the cultural weather. As the late 1990s tipped toward the early 2000s, the aesthetic landscape shifted. The clean optimism of some mainstream fashion surged. Logos grew and shrank in cycles. New brands arrived with different kinds of cool. Less, I fear nothing. More, I don't care whether you notice me, fearing nothing. Irony matured from a teenager's defense mechanism into a full-time cultural job, and slogans that once sounded profound began to sound like a stranger shouting at you in a parking lot. There was also the simple problem of saturation. When a trend becomes ubiquitous, it stops functioning as a signal of individuality. If everyone in the hallway is wearing a shirt that suggests they live on the edge, then the edge starts to look suspiciously like the cafeteria. The brand's voice, so striking at first, risked becoming background noise. The slogans didn't change as much as the audience did. The kids who once wore those statements as armor grew older and began to see the world with enough nuance to recognize that fear is sometimes just the brain doing its job. The bravado aged. Some people outgrew it. Some people kept a shirt in a drawer like a fossil from an earlier self, faded to a soft gray. The letters cracked like an old joke. Yet No Fear didn't vanish completely, because trends rarely die. They mostly change addresses. The brand continued in various forms, and the business story took turns that reflected the volatility of fashion and licensing. In 2011, No Fear filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. And later that year, the UK-based sports retailer Frasers Group, then known as Sports Direct International, bought the brand. In the grand cycle of consumer culture, this is a common fate. What begins as a niche signal becomes a mass phenomenon, then a nostalgia item, then a label in a larger portfolio, surfacing again on racks where someone discovers it the way archaeologists discover pottery shards. When viewed from a distance, the No Fear trend is funny for the same reason it was powerful. It took the private intensity of adolescence and printed it in public. It treated the hallway like an arena. It turned everyday insecurity into a chest-thumped creed. A kid could be terrified of a math test, worried about fitting in, unsure of who they were becoming, and still walk around with a shirt that declared the opposite. The brand didn't eliminate fear. It offered a costume that made fear look less like weakness and more like something you could wrestle into a corner with a clever phrase. It also captured a specific 1990s optimism about danger, the belief that risk was not only survivable, but stylish. That belief lived in extreme sports, in loud graphics, in the era's fascination with pushing limits. No Fear simply gave it a font and a distribution network. It was a brand that understood the teenage appetite for drama and the American habit of treating attitude as an accessory. And perhaps that is why it remains so easy to remember. Plenty of trends leave behind photos, but No Fear left behind sentences. People can still recall their favorite lines the way they recall lyrics, not because the slogans were literary masterpieces, but because they were stitched to a time in life when everything felt like it mattered intensely, even if it was just what you wore on a Tuesday. The shirts, for all their bravado, were oddly sincere artifacts of a decade that loved its extremes. They promised invincibility in a world where invincibility was mostly theoretical. They sold a little courage, a little performance, and a lot of identity. In the end, the trend faded the way many cultural sensations do. Not with a final curtain, but with a slow dimming. The shirts were worn less frequently. The decals peeled. The slogans became punchlines, then nostalgia, then vintage finds that made someone grin in a thrift store, as if they'd spotted a familiar face in a crowd. And somewhere in that grin is the lingering truth No Fear accidentally captured. Growing up is scary. So sometimes you put on a shirt that insists it isn't, and you walk into the day like you mean it.
Come along, let's sing, where the joy will bring. Tune into the beat, feel the magic, it's true. Channel 199X, we're here just for you.